Well, let's bring in now my political panel today, National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie. Wonderful to have you in Sydney today.
Fantastic to be here, Shari.
And Labor MP for Fraser, Daniel Molino. Great to see you, Daniel. Now, Daniel, starting with you on this. So Tony Burke there saying decision hasn't been made, but he's considering legislation in this area. What do you think? Do you think legislation's actually needed to stop bosses from contacting workers after hours?
Well, look, my personal view here is that this is something that's worth exploring, but on a very sector-specific basis. Look, I think everybody probably expects that in the world of political advising that wouldn't work. There are probably a range of other areas where people are on call where it wouldn't work. But think about people, for example, in retail where they might work 9 to 5 or hospitality or a range of other sectors. I think setting in place mechanisms, whether it's legislation or some other mechanism, where it's made clear that there shouldn't be an expectation that if the boss sends you an email at 9 p.m, you're expected to read it right there and then. I think that's reasonable in a whole range of sectors, and that it's worth exploring.
What do you think about this, Bridget?
Yeah, well, having been the Emergency Management Minister during the Lismore floods, I can absolutely say being an advisor to a minister or a politician does require you to work outside of 9 to 5, as do a whole lot of other jobs. And I think that sector issue is quite relevant. And in Australia, we have pay and conditions to actually reflect that. So if you're expected to be on call and available to the boss outside your normal office hours, then that's reflected in additional pay rates, etc. So I would hate to see the situation, though, where it's pitting boss against worker. Usually the boss might, if you're in a small business, for instance, that they might only have time at 9 o'clock to actually shoot an email, having no expectation that it will be responded to that evening at all, but it might be their only opportunity to actually communicate. So there's a lot to work through with this, and I think what we've seen from the Labor Party, though, since coming to power, the unions have a lot of say in this government. It's been driving a lot of their decision making, and I want to make sure we're as productive and as competitive as possible so that we can really power our economy for decades to come.
Well, that's part of the industrial relations legislation that Tony Burke is putting forward, that he does want to give the unions greater access to companies and employers and the records that they keep. Daniel Molino, do you think that would be a good thing?
Well, look, I just take a step back when thinking about the IR laws that are coming through the system. The current opposition, when they were in government in the lead up to the last election, said that an increase in the minimum wage of $1 an hour would be a disaster for the economy. And when we debated the last tranche of IR legislation, there were some pretty over-the-top statements made about what would happen. And in fact, since then and during the first year of this government, we've seen more jobs created than any other government ever. So, look, I just think we've got to take a bit of perspective on some of these issues. Look, we haven't even seen the legislation yet, and I think clearly there's a raft of issues which it's trying to address, like the fact that there's a bunch of people working side by side with very different conditions where that may not be justifiable. Let's see the legislation, but let's make sure that we go through a consultation process and make sure it's fit for purpose. But there are a bunch of issues out there in workplaces that do need to be looked at.
I've never seen the business community as united as I'm seeing them at the moment. This isn't because they're anti-worker. It is because they know this proposal will be unworkable. And every single decision that this government makes, whether it's Jim Chalmers coming out and saying he's not going to do tax reform, or we'll put competition policy out to the never never, or Catherine King's decision recently to not let Qatar Airways provide more competition into our international airline system.
And we're going to talk about that now.
Every single decision, though, is making us less productive and making it harder to do business and slowing our productive capacity across the economy. And that, in the end, hurts Australians through increasing cost of living prices.